And I think you hit the nail on the head there at the moment, is that ultimately SGT charging, predominantly, we speak about it from generation terms, because on the whole, it's often generators that trigger new SGTs that's going through, or historically, proportionally, or more recently it has been. But it applies to demand as well as generation. And then the idea of where you set the limits and who's exposed to that, and a 1 megawatt factory or school potentially triggering a 12, 14, 16 million pound SGT and associated costs for it. So yeah, it gets quite complicated quite quickly.
Welcome to the Connectology podcast. I'm Hugh Taylor, CEO here at Road Knight Taylor, and in these episodes, our grid connection specialists, the Connectologists, dive into the evolving grid connections landscape, often taking expert guests with them in order to discover, generate, and share insights that might just help you and maybe even industry as a whole to connect projects faster, at lower risk, and at lower cost.
Hello and welcome to a Connectology podcast. I'm Kyle Murchie. I'm joined by Nikki and Philip. Hi guys.
Hi.
Today we're going to talk to you about network boundary charges. We have covered this topic before, but we're wanting to have a little bit more of a conversation about where those two modifications have got to. The modifications we're going to talk about are DCP461 and CMP460. So let's get into it. Obviously these two mods have been ongoing for a little while now. We wanted to talk about them because one's now out to consultation, another's about to go out to consultation shortly. So it's a good time to get into some nitty-gritty and find out what's happening. So, Nikki, with DCP 461, that was focused much more from a distribution perspective. And I think when we last talked about it, there were a lot of options on the table.
Yes.
So what's this consultation looking to find out?
So, to be honest, there's still quite a few options on the table. So we have at least 5. So we've definitely got rid of 2. So the 2 options were, if anyone read the consultation, they were 1.3 and 2.3. So that was having it based on essentially like the voltage rule, which we kind of discounted now. So we now have 1.1, 1.2, 2.1, 2.2, and 3.1.
It's simple.
So to kind of expand on that, 1.1 and 1.2 are essentially socializing it via DCP461. So 1.1 is sort of that complete socialization option. 1.2 is the option to socialize unless it's feeding the GSP is feeding a single customer. 2.1 and 2.2 are then the CAF solutions. So 2.1 is just a CAF, and then 2.2 is considering a capacity threshold, which I think is definitely something that we used in there. And then 3.1 is a not a do nothing option, but it's a kind of a status quo while having some much clearer guidance for how that's administered.
Okay, so quite a broad range then. Although it's been whittled down, you've either got something that's going to be basically everything DCP460 to some extent, most of it CAF'd, or do as we do today, but maybe have some level of alignment or guidance. But so what's coming out of the working group? Is there a kind of hot favourite, or is it quite mixed? So,
I don't think there is, to be honest. We're going to spend quite a lot of time thinking about what the options are, what we're going to present to people. Working group wise, I think we've got a very diverse group of people in the working group, so I don't think there's a clear kind of front runner favourite from that perspective. My own personal view would probably be that 2.2 is quite a good option in terms of being palatable to Ofgem. Having that CAF with a capacity kind of limit is a good idea in my opinion. That's the one I would go for.
I think you hit the nail on the head around a lot of this. It's everyone coming in from different angles will have different views, and ultimately, whatever has been proposed at an industry level, we do need to consider the impact to the end customer and what is palatable for them. Because obviously, if you're going down a CAF route, then that means that whatever is not being paid for by the person connecting needs to be paid for by somewhere, and of which point then the impact on society. So I think that's something that we need to keep all coming back to. we think the current system is unfair and broken and stifling. We want to move to something that is what we think is better. But in order to implement something is better, we need to consider the end impact on customers generally.
That brings us on actually quite nicely, Philip, to CMP460, which, just kind of going back a little bit, the reason for 460 is to look at the bigger picture, the kind of longer term, and it's a bit of a longer mod. It's not going to come into force until
April, potentially.
Yeah. So it's going to be a bit of a kind of longer run. But with this one, so where are we now? Because there are 3 options on the table. Obviously, with a cusp mod, there needs to be an original proposal. You still whittle that down. So what's that looking like?
So yeah, I should also say April 27 is potential implementation date for it rather than 26.
Yes.
So in terms of the 3 options, option 1 was basically treat everything like an infrastructure asset. So everything that had the capability of being shareable, having more than one customer connected into there, would effectively be treated the same way that we have at the moment with an infrastructure GSP or an infrastructure asset. The second proposal was effectively to treat everything like it's a connection site. So effectively nothing being infrastructure, and at which point keeping everything consistent, which I think lots of people didn't like for obvious reasons of the complexity of what you do at existing infrastructure sites. And option 3 looked at some form of sharing type aspect of going through and some sort of proportionality to it, which ended up being discounted, I think, primarily because it's quite complicated for a range of different reasons. And one of the complications was, if you consider everything as being thermally driven, that's one thing. But what do you do when someone has a connection to a GSP that's driven for N-2 reasons, for demand or for fault level or for voltage reasons? And how do you go through and apportion things on those bases? So ultimately, the front runner from the working group perspective of most people that are in there has been option 1, which is basically any asset that could be shareable from an SGT basis would end up being an infrastructure asset and ultimately would be put onto TNUoS and then paid for ultimately by demand customers.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one because we've, comparing the two, we seem to have almost the same sort of kind of approach where one's either going to socialize everything, another's putting a lot more onto the customer, although in this particular case we're talking about everything effectively going to the customer and having no infrastructure sites. Or that third option, which feels, well, and we've talked about it before, it feels like probably the right thing to do. It's probably the best option because it has that balance between your customer triggering some work and therefore they're taking on some of the burden, but also recognizing that it's not set up to pass everything through to a small factory which has triggered these works. But being complicated makes it quite difficult to develop within a working group.
And I think you hit the nail on the head there at the moment, is that ultimately SGT charging, predominantly we speak about it from generation terms because on the whole it's often generators that trigger new SGTs that's going through, or historically, proportionally, or more recently has been. But it applies to demand as well as generation. And then the idea of where you set the limits and who's exposed to that, and a 1 megawatt factory or school potentially triggering a 12, 14, 16 million pound SGT and associated costs for it. So yeah, it gets quite complicated quite quickly.
Yeah, particularly with that postcode lottery, because SGTs are not equal. But at the same time, if you're building a new substation, there's very similar shared costs, irrespective of whether you're putting in a 460 or a 40 MVA transformer.
Yep.
It's not quite as a kind of clear cut as the size. So thinking about where we are now with both those mods, lots of progress has been made. But what's the next step? So where's 460 at the moment?
So 460 is currently in its consultation stage. I'm just looking at the phone. So it came out on the 20th of January. It runs till the 18th of February, 26 in terms of the consultation. We'd encourage people to feed back in and give their views. We will be feeding into that consultation. And then hopefully some whack-ons will end up coming out from that. And then the work group will end up voting on ultimately the original and the whack-ons.
Thank you for listening so far. If insights like these are valuable in your work, then feel free to subscribe and stay current as Britain's connections landscape continues to evolve. Now, back to the connectologists.
Yeah, it's a really good point to make that although the original's going forward based on that feedback that comes through the consultation, one of the members can put forward an alternative, and if that gets voted through, become a Wacom. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity to bring back those options that are still on the table, that option 2 and 3, or another.
Or a flavour rather than, yeah, absolutely. Or something with some checks and balances in there.
Yeah. And the same question for you, Nikki, there on DCP461. Are they out to consultation yet?
No, so we are aiming to finalise it this week and then get out ASAP.
Brilliant. So when this podcast goes out, we're probably talking, it might be out now. So yeah, probably second week in February then. It looks like that's when the consultation might go out. And do you have any idea of timeline? How long is it going to be open for? Do we know yet?
I think it's 3 weeks.
3 weeks. Okay. It's likely that
3 weeks.
DCP461 will finish a week, maybe 2 weeks ahead of 461. And just conscious that there's lots of other consultations going on, others that we know about, which we'll probably talk about on Grid Views and Views. So, so what is the ask? Do we want people to feed into both? Do you want people to feed into kind of join up and go through a trade body? What's the kind of best approach? If people had limited time, what do we want to get across?
I think I'd probably recommend that people, at the very least, get their views into a trade body, whether it's Regen, RUK, SEUK, or whatever trade body they might be a part of.
Others are available.
If you have got time, we need lots of different reviews in these consultations. This is a big thing. It's really important that lots and lots of different people's voices are heard. So it can be really beneficial to have those sort of individual responses as well as the trade body ones as well. So yeah, people have got time. Appreciate there's a lot going on at the moment. Then I would recommend people feed into both of them.
So from my perspective, I'd say the working group is primarily made up of obviously NISOs, the TOs, the DNOs, and developers and consultants and high DNOs are also involved in the working group. But that's quite a small segment of society in terms of this, because it will impact demand customers. It will impact, obviously, bills in the end sort of level. So I think for me, I quite like the consultation to be assessed from all aspects of the energy system, to come in and put views, and hopefully that will potentially result in either modifications to the original or to a Wacom in terms of coming through, because going back to earlier, being very conscious of, we need to make sure that the proposal that's going forwards to Ofgem to be voted on is fair and equitable, and ultimately something that they think is a likely for sort of GBPLC.
Yeah, it's a good point. In these working groups, you always tend to inevitably get people that are most active in the industry, which tend to be backed by the companies that are most active in the industry, and not necessarily those that are possibly going to be impacted the most. I think with both these mods, it's worth saying that there's lots of projects that have come across this problem before, but never accepted, never become contracted, because they did see the problem and move away and go down a different route. I think the demand in particular, we see a lot of clients that have that same issue where it's become a barrier, they can't move forward with the project, and it then never actually falls onto the official list. So there's a lot of hidden projects that we probably want to draw out of the consultation, which would be great.
And I think one of the things that I'm hoping that gets picked up in the consultation a little more, and I think I'll be sort of responding to on there, is potentially with this work of the role of the rests. I think the complexity of that is when the rests start to really pick up and start to produce outputs in terms of recommendations of what should be done, where and when. There is much more of a focus now on where should there be investment ahead of need. And I think for me, it feels like with CMP460, if we are going down a route where all assets should be considered as infrastructure, when does it stop? When does it become a natural barrier where you say, actually, it's not in the interest of customers to have that extra SGT, and it's only providing a benefit for a small section, and what ends up being the wider benefit to the whole country in terms of energy cost and system access and where generation is. So it's a real fine mix around gate tooth and in terms of what is needed, where and how much, and then future demand, and then looking into all of these things as to what should be built where and when and what scale and capability. And potentially for me, if the RESPs can end up feeding into that, we may well get that balance between doing the right thing of preventing the postcode lottery and stifling projects until something happens which changes the substation to infrastructure, and potentially allow the logical thing to happen earlier, which ends up being better sort of holistic view and costless aspects.
Great. So we've covered quite a lot. Maybe just as a quick fire to kind of round it off. So if you had to choose one option that was on the table, either from DCP461 or 460, what would it be, Nikki?
I would choose the CAF with a capacity threshold. And I would probably set this capacity threshold fairly high, maybe at 10 or maybe not including 11 kV projects or something like that. Just to kind of exclude those smaller customers, sort of community initiatives, smaller projects that just don't really need to be feeding into this. And yeah, it seems to me like most kind of, I'm going to say like the best option for the end consumer. While due also be a good option for developers. I think equally kind of developers are okay with paying for reinforcement as long as they know what that's going to be. It's that kind of having a very high upper limit of that reinforcement that's not palatable for most developers. So, yeah, probably
That's certainty as well, but doesn't change.
Yeah,
The same question.
I love the idea of a CAF, and the engineer in me feels like it is the best and the fairest way of going through and doing it. Based on the work in 460, my concern is that there are too many ifs and buts and ands and exceptions, which then means that might be incredibly challenging. So I think ultimately I'm broadly supportive of option one, which is the sort of original proposal, which is everything becoming an infrastructure asset, as long as there is the checks and balances in there that then makes it a palatable option, with the expectations that if those costs are being saved in one area, it should result in lower cost of energy for others. And I think there is just some elements that are needed to stop people gaming the system on that basis. So that's where I'd like to go, as a modified version of option one, if we end up doing a Wacom on that basis.
Brilliant. Well, hope that has helped clarify what these boards are and where we're at. Also, really importantly, those consultations will probably be both open by the time this goes out, and we would really appreciate the industry kind of coming together and feeding in. So, thank you very much, Nikki. Thank you very much, Philip, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining the Connectologists in this exploration. This knowledge sharing is made possible by the support of our clients. We thank them and hope it will help the whole of industry to connect society's critical infrastructure faster. If you found this useful, you're welcome to explore more free insights at roadnighttaylor.co.uk/connectology, or click on the Insights tab at the top of our homepage. Thank you.